Hello, nonprofit leaders. I'm Sarah Olivieri, your host, and this podcast is here to assist people like you, executive directors, board members, and other nonprofit leaders, make a bigger impact with insights, tips, and lessons learned from nonprofit leaders and experts. Having been an executive director, a board member, and now a consultant and coach, I truly understand the challenges you face. And that's why I'm here. I'm all about working smarter, not harder, so you can make a bigger impact without the burnout. And so is our sponsor, DonorBox. DonorBox isn't just a suite of helpful fundraising tools, it's a partner that helps you raise more money and supports you in retaining your donors. I love their forward-thinking approach. Visit donorbox.org to learn more. And don't forget to sign up for the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, where you'll get bite-sized, actionable tips just for nonprofit leaders like you, delivered weekly to your inbox. Sign up at inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Okay, let's dive into today's episode. My guest for this episode is Rebecca Sutherns, who is a PhD and the CEO and founder of Sage Solutions, empowering purpose-driven leaders to align what's important to them with what they actually do. With over 27 years of global experience as a best-selling author, master facilitator, and coach, she uniquely helps clients leverage imagination as a strategic superpower, bringing analytical rigor, warm energy, and adaptability to strategy and governance. Through her Elastic framework, Rebecca helps nonprofit leaders collectively reimagine their next chapter. She champions imagination as a learnable skill via strategic planning facilitation, and her conversations starting possibility packs, fostering vivid, shared mental pictures to proactively dent the world. I love it. Welcome, Rebecca. Before we dive into things, imagination and nonprofit leadership, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself personally so we can get to know you?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's funny when you think about how to introduce yourself to people you don't know, right? You get to choose all different ways to tell that story. Maybe in this context, what's most important is that I do specialize in working with nonprofit leaders. I've done that for 28 years, but in the midst of that, have raised 4 great humans that are now in their 20s and am called Minga by 2 grandbabies that also thankfully live walkable to me. And when I'm not kind of hanging out with that whole crew and doing my solopreneurial stuff, I really love to travel and to knit, and sometimes both of those things at the same time. So feel free to dig into any of that, but that's the very short version of who you're talking to.
I love it. Well, I used to be a very avid knitter. I clearly wore the right sweater today, which I didn't knit, but is hand knit very nicely. And grandbabies and everything, that's really, really wonderful to have that family around you. I want to start with imagination. And I was really interested in speaking with you because it's like a frustration that I have, when I look at the world and I look at the state of like nonprofit organizations kind of versus for-profit entrepreneur space. I find the entrepreneur space is full of abundance mindset and excitement and like wild imagination of better futures. And the nonprofit space isn't. And I want it to be the opposite. I mean, I think everybody should have great imaginations and vivid futures, but if it had to be one or the other, I wish it to be the nonprofit space that was full of abundance and big imagination and visioning. But I've seen in my own work, often you get in a room with nonprofit leaders, especially, you're so overwhelmed. You ask them to envision or imagine something bold, and they're like, I just wish I had enough money to pay my staff. So tell me how you come to this work of imagination and what you see.
Absolutely. Let me leverage the idea of that scarcity piece, because there's a question that I do often ask people, and I have to ask it carefully because I don't want it to generate eye rolls, which is a legitimate response. If money were no object, right? It's not my favorite. But at the same time, I actually want to ask it fairly seriously of my nonprofit clients to say, if we could take the money conversation off the table for a moment, What do you want to do? What do you want to build? What do you want to create? How do you wish things were different other than you wish you had more money, right? Like if that whole conversation about the finances of this sector kind of uses up all the oxygen in the room to the
Yeah.
point that I think people just don't spend a lot of time thinking about anything else. And I say that with very low judgment because I get it. If I can't make payroll, I don't have the luxury of kind of imagining what I wish the future were like. I get the sort of hierarchy of needs in that. And I do also want to say that across nonprofit spaces, my experience is that, first of all, they're very diverse. And so I'm always a little reluctant to talk about them as if they're one category. And they're filled with resourceful people who are working in an environment of often financial scarcity, although that's not necessarily true. When I tell people that I work in the nonprofit space, they assume that I work with small, struggling organizations. And I don't. There are lots, but there are lots that are not. I would not ever describe them as that.
Yeah.
And so let me sort of transition into that imagination idea. I am a firm believer in that our strategies ought to be forward facing, not backward facing. And often some of the tools that we bring into the strategy room, if I can say that, are rear view mirror kinds of tool. Legitimate to look at your previous strategy, to look at your data. I would prefer that to not looking at those things. But those are what happened in the past. And we don't spend a lot of time saying, what are we trying to build together? And partly why I live in the nonprofit space and not as much in the private sector, although I sometimes do, is I think that we've got some debates to have inside any nonprofit or inside their systems that they're part of about what a win looks like. So if I'm in an exclusively private sector environment, that's a weird question to ask because they go, well, it's something to do with shareholder value, profitability, market share, something like that. Whereas in the nonprofit space, there are lots of ways to win the game, right? And there isn't really a shared definition often about what success looks like. And so that's just one very practical reason why we need to cast forward and say to people, when it comes to, for example, visioning, I'm not really that interested in writing the vision statement, although we can. It's more about tell me what a win looks like. Tell me what you're trying to build or create or change. And it's amazing to me when we get around a table of people how varied those answers are. And so my interest is not only in helping people imagine a more inspiring and compelling future, because I think when we do that, we are more likely to move toward it, but it's also helping them align on that. And I know you speak on this podcast about alignment at points. And I think if people are not watching the same movie in their heads of what that desired future looks like, there's a good chance you're using the same language, but you're actually moving in different directions.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I always think of clarifying a vision is like 99% an alignment tool and 1% a direction tool in that you can change direction at any time. Having a vision doesn't mean like you can't change that vision, but you need everybody imagining collectively that you're going in that place to that vision in order for everybody to start moving there. And then then you can help them, you can create a new vision, but and that wasn't something like I learned, just off the bat. It took me years in business before, somebody basically just said, you can just scrap your vision and have a new one anytime. It was like, oh, thank you for like freeing me in that world. It kind of changed my life with that simple comment. So I love to ask you, because you've clearly spent a lot of time thinking about how to help people imagine. And I know from my own work, I haven't gone as deeply as you have, that the way we ask a question dramatically impacts how people think. Like you already shared, like, what if money, weren't on the table? And when I need to ask that question, I usually, take a pen or something like I have my magic wand and I have just given you $10 million, right? So now what do we do? Because I know that it changes, like, I just gave them the money so that they didn't have to ignore the problem, or framing questions in the future, and I'm wondering, like, how have you found to help people imagine better and more boldly?
Great question. I think it does matter how we frame questions, what order we ask them in, who's in the room to answer them. There's lots of ways we can get at this, but there's also some very almost tactical tips that I would have. And I would start with where you are physically when you're having the conversation or conversations, plural, because
Mm.
the environments we're in shape the answers we give. And so
Yeah.
if we're holding strategy conversations, in the same old boring meeting room where somebody else just, had to do, I don't know, budget cuts or something last week, the likelihood of feeling really inspired is lower than if we are somewhere inspiring. And so I pay attention to venue and location quite a bit. And that doesn't have to be a pricey, go away on a, beach on an offsite or something. But if you can get people into unfamiliar or otherwise inspiring environments, they are likely to be more imaginative. It also has to do with how you frame and set up the occasion, because I'd like it to be a bit of an occasion as opposed to, let's talk about budget, let's talk about parking spots, let's talk about signage. Okay, now it's time to reimagine our thing, right? And then people kind of go, well, you're not being very creative. And it's again, no kidding, the energy in the space and the sequencing of things has deflated the conversation before it even begun. So there's some setup that I think has to happen, but it's also a habit, I think, of helping people picture what they're going after together more vividly. Because I think we can maybe share kind of a rough pencil sketch, of what we're looking for. But when we take the time to make that sketch more vivid, to add some color and shading and shadow and context, all of a sudden the group can say, oh, that's interesting. Literally, the movie I'm watching in my head does look like your movie in these ways, but it's actually different in these other ways. And we can have conversations about details. Again, we may not get exactly to that place, but having those conversations of saying, I don't picture it that way. That's not actually a win for me. And here's why, allows us to have really interesting dialogues that if we just stopped at, we're trying to make the world a better place. Yeah, who isn't? And everybody kind of nods and you move forward as if that is a unifying picture, and it's not quite. And we want it to be so vivid that people can see themselves in it, that they are motivated by it. And so I think one of the other framing questions for me is how people even understand vision in the first place, if we're using that language at all. Because if they think of vision as something that we will never get to, our brains very quickly go to, well, if we'll never get there, like, why even bother almost? Whereas if we can pull vision in a little closer and keep it close to say, what would an achievable, um, motivating end state look like? Call it 1 generation from now.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden we're not talking 500 years from now or maybe never. And I think in a very volatile, dynamic context that we're in right now, we need things to be motivating, but also close, that we can sort of know where those North Stars are, but also be adaptable around it. And so sometimes when I use the word imagination, people think woo woo, right? They think rainbows and unicorns and kitty stuff. And, there can be that. But I think we can also bring it really close to say, imagine if your organization were a little more like, or imagine if you as a leader could borrow a teaspoon of so-and-so's ability to do ABC. And
Mhm.
imagination in that too. So it's not just, literally rainbows and unicorns or what's going to happen 100 years from now or on Mars. It's actually, imagine if we, what would happen if we blah, blah, blah. And I think there's a real power in creating space and time to have those conversations together.
Yeah, I love that, and especially one thing I haven't really heard before or thought about much before is using the power of imagining, like you said, like borrowing something from somebody, or it caused me to actually I like imagining things. Like, what if, it's like, what if your organization all of a sudden lived at Google's headquarters, right? Like, not that that is the goal, but like all of a sudden, like you start visualizing and thinking about possibilities, like unlocks things in your brain just the way it like creating contextual boundaries often unlocks our creativity, right? Like you have to do this, but you can't, you have to draw a picture, but you can't use purple or red, and it actually causes us to be more creative. I think putting ourselves visually in different scenarios or borrowing skills from different folks is so powerful. It also reminds me of, oh, I'm going to blank on his name. He wrote a book called Alter Ego. He's a, yeah.
Where
Oh,
Beyonce's written about in there with
yeah, yeah, and he works with high performance people, and one of his tricks for helping high performance athletes and performers and business folks do better is to have create like this alter ego, a super power version of themselves and draw from those strengths. And sometimes it's easier to pull from strengths in an imagined version, but then they become your real strengths than it is to just say, "Oh, I gotta pick myself up from my own bootstraps."
Absolutely. And I think another piece of this for me is that what it does by having these conversations is it puts us in a place of remembering that we don't just inherit the future, that it's not just kind of we're not put upon, it's like you're going to just have it. It's we actually have a role in shaping it. And so the idea, there's a famous quote, I think they attribute it to Peter Drucker, but it's not for sure that it was him. But the idea is that the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think what it does is it helps people feel a sense of autonomy and agency in bending things in a direction that's good for them, as opposed to feeling like all the things, all the stress, all the, world volatility is weighing us down. It helps us find some space for action in that. And
Yeah.
also says, how do I want to show up? I mean, if people are looking around and casting about, or who do I want to borrow a teaspoon of for inspiration? I want to be one of those people on people's lists, right? So there's kind of a personal piece to this as well as an organizational piece. And I think part of what I do as a facilitator and coach is help people have a more kind of vivid picture of that. And as you've said, one of the ways to do that is actually to give them some constraints because our creativity is sort of accelerated in the presence of constraints. So back to what you said about scarcity, if people are working in a really scarce mindset kind of way of, oh, we don't have the time, we don't have the money, whatever, I try to say, without being, annoyingly positive about it, to say, good, let's treat that as a constraint and our creativity will thrive in constraints because we actually don't cope well with no limits. We need some edges. So here's some edges. Let's imagine within that. And
Mhm.
so, that affects how you run, brainstorming sessions. And so, as a really practical, if someone is listening going, what do I do? You're not going to hear me run a brainstorming session where I say, whatever you want, every idea is a good idea. It's like, no, actually, we have to spend whatever. We have 50 grand to spend in the next 6 months. Now tell me your good ideas, right? So some of the vetting criteria that we will eventually use are made explicit right from the start and say, okay, inside this container, let's imagine. But you don't want that container to be too small and too much of a lid on it because you need to have some early ideas that you then decide, are we going to throw money at this or not? And rather than saying too early, we don't know how to do that, we don't have the budget for that, we don't have the right people for that, I would like a group to say, oh, imagine if we did that. And then all of a sudden you go, we got to find the people. We got to find the skills. We got to find the money. That's amazing. So if we put kind of achievability in as a criteria too soon, we miss out on some of the possibilities. So I'm constantly I feel like as a facilitator, my job is to help people live right in the middle of
Mm.
not being so generic or so sort of blue sky that all of a sudden it's become completely not just unachievable, but we can't even picture it in the same way. But you also don't want it to be limited by the constraints of today because those change and we can also choose to change them if we choose to invest in particular directions. And so I like the in-betweenness of that. I spend a lot of my life and a lot of my mind space goes to those liminal spaces for individuals and organizations where we have to live with the contradiction. And usually in the midst of that is where good stuff happens.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing that kind of level of detail to, how do we create that liminal space, because so often I hear people who've been like, well, imagining 10 years from now doesn't work for me, or imagining 3 years from now doesn't work for me. And I was like, well, that's because it's not just 10 years or 3 years. And feel free to disagree, but I've always felt like it's far enough into the future that you're not overly preoccupied with the how. We're gonna get there,
Yeah.
but not so far that it feels like that's distant future, we're never gonna get there, right? Like, so and then to me, like, that's how I talk about, like, that liminal space of just it makes me think of, like, I was quoting this the other day with great copywriters, they have this quote, "How long should it be? Long enough, as long as it needs to be and no longer." Right? Which in some ways is helpful and in some ways is not helpful. But the truth is, there's a reality there as long as, as far as it needs to be and no farther, I feel like kind of applies to imagination as you're describing it.
It does kind of affect our posture, right? You want to be casting, like, it's kind of like a stretch, but not too much of a stretch. You mentioned in the intro that I work with the image of elastic. And if we think about like a rubber band, literally, if you don't stretch it at all, it becomes brittle. It falls apart in your hand. It's not being used for the purpose for which it was intended. And obviously, if you stretch it too far, it's going to snap. And if you hold it stretched for too long, it's not going to snap necessarily, but it's not going to spring back to its original form, which is partly what makes something elastic by definition in the first place, right? So you're constantly trying to find the right, like the optimal level of stretch. And I feel like that's true in this exercise as well, where you you want to be far enough that kind of people go, "Ooh," a little gasp of like, oh, I don't know. And but not so much that they check out. And the thing I notice is that we actually are just not very good at this. It's a muscle that we as adults have let atrophy, and or we think of it as, I don't know, building towers out of marshmallows and toothpicks or something that make us grown. And I actually think we've got to find good questions, good experiences, good scaffolding for people to build their muscle in this area, because in theory, adults should be better at this than kids. And I'll tell you why. It's because our creativity and our innovation and our imagination actually comes from our memories primarily. And so that's how it works neurologically. And so our memory bank is the pantry that we're gathering ingredients from when we go to imagine something. So if I said to you, I don't know, think of a new color, it's really impossible for us not to build a new color from an old color. Or if I said, imagine if we went to Paris. If you've ever been to Paris before or you've seen pictures of Paris, you can riff off of my prompt and go, yeah, we could go, on those beautiful boats along the Seine and up the Eiffel Tower. If you've never heard of Paris ever, you are not going to be able to build on my idea. You're going to be like, I know what that is. So in theory, an adult has a bigger pantry of ingredients than any kid because we've lived longer. And so one of the really concrete and I think fun and exciting tips I can bring people in terms of how do I get better at this? How do I work my imagination muscle? It can come from availing yourself of a variety of experiences. Whether, if you have an opportunity to travel, that is one great way of doing that. If you can introduce diversity into your life in any other ways, do that. Eat different stuff, walk a different way to work, meet a wider range of people. And if some of those things feel out of reach for you, it literally can come from reading books, like immersing yourself in environments that are unfamiliar to you. You don't have to physically go there to have the brain benefit of learning about experiences that you haven't had. And so variety is one of my highly held, strongly held values in some ways. And so I love this possibility that when we look at the research of how to build many of these elastic leadership skills, they all can come. It's a bit like when you go to the doctor or check in on your health, and almost everything is made at least a little bit better by exercise and good sleep and good nutrition. I feel like variety in our lives and introducing diverse experiences is that kind of, there's no one magic bullet, but boy, that can't help.
Yeah.
Do
Wow.
good things for you.
So powerful. And, it goes, back. I was listening to reading a conversation on LinkedIn this week about sometimes the bad rep that like consultants and coaches get. And clearly there have been some bad consultants and coaches, but there's so many good ones. And one of the things, having been a nonprofit leader myself multiple times and being a coach, trainer, consultant for many years, I am so much better as the coach trainer because of that variety, because I have seen so many different teams and different scenarios and different constraints. My ability to imagine options is broad because I have this whole memory bank of like, well, I've seen it work this way and not work that way and things, it's just like there's so much more juicy context to pull from and imagine from, and I think that's often, what bringing in an outside person who has the opportunity to see a lot of variety can really help an organization. Plus, they aren't all in the weeds, right? I always have an advantage in some ways of looking from the outside and a disadvantage because I don't have all of the information, right? You need both, I think, to really, stretch what the possibilities are. And just believe so strongly that the more we leverage people's brains, is how I call it, and the more we have options, the better our decisions will be as we move forward.
Yeah,
I
that's
want to ask,
with
yeah,
my experience too. So I just wanted to affirm what yours.
yeah, great. I want to ask you before we run out of time, tell us about your elastic framework.
Sure, there's a book behind it. So if anybody's into reading books, you can look for the book with my name. But I think the content of it that is important for conversations like this has two parts. One is the actual metaphor, and I mentioned it already, of an elastic band and being appropriately stretched without being overstretched so that we snap or we can't snap back, but also not understretched so that we're underutilized or that we're snapping back into old patterns that don't fit us anymore. And that's true personally and organizationally. I think it's really important for us to ask a question like, what do we want now? Or who are we now, as opposed to who have we always been, and being sort of slotted into roles that we've outgrown. And I hope that that's actually true for people, is that we are growing enough that old ways of doing things just aren't suiting us. So there's a whole metaphor around elasticity that I think is helpful. And then it's also an acronym for those letters of the word elastic that highlight some leadership behaviors that I find really help us develop that kind of stretchiness. And so I won't go into them in detail, but just very briefly, the E is about energy. And that has to do with guarding our own energy and paying attention to it as a signal in other people and being the kind of leader that boosts it for people. Likability, which is the one that I always go, oh, I wish that weren't included. But the research is clear. If we want to be an influential leader that has followers, we need to be people who are persuasive and have influence. And the way we get that is through people liking us. And by that, I don't just mean they think we're cool. They think we are competent and they trust us. And so there's an element of competence and character and sort of benevolence, like that we are looking out for other people. That likability is really important. A is for adaptability. I could talk about that all day long. You're welcome to have me back to talk about that. It's a big part of my coaching and organizational leadership practice, is helping people understand what's fixed and what's flexible and how to follow path toward adaptability that suit what you love, because we don't have to be exhausted by change. We can actually be energized by it. So that's ELA. S
Mhm.
is not just strategic planning, but strategic thinking, where we're linking long-term big picture stuff, high altitude work with day-to-day work. And I think strategic leaders are really good at that. The T is for trust. There's lots of writing on this, but it's just so important. I needed to include it. And one of the key takeaways of that is that we build trust initially and ongoing by extending it to others more than by expecting it from others. And so if people are interested in trust, you can look there. I is on imagination. We've talked about that already. And then the C is for curiosity. And I feel like curiosity has, it's one of those things that I'm seeing it absolutely everywhere as a desirable quality. And certainly the research would bear that out, that curious people have all kinds of other good things going on in their lives. But it's not a uniformly distributed skill, and it is a skill. And so those are the elements of the elastic acronym that I lean into when I'm working with leaders.
So much good stuff in there. I'm definitely gonna go look for the book. I am a reader, a slow reader, not an easy reader, but I love there's so much richness in books. And I think especially like when someone like you or, Alter Ego, which was Todd Herman, like when someone writes a book, they are pouring so much into it. Like there is so much in there. But there's also so much you just shared in that acronym, and I love that it ended with curiosity, which I think being a curious leader is kind of coming into the vernacular in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago for sure. And I was just talking about this with a client yesterday who's involved with systems change and thinks about being curious a lot. And they're experts in bringing diverse community members together kind of to become more, collaborate as community. And the conversation was actually about how part of the conversation was about how staying curious, being, she calls it sometimes a beginner's mind, actually helps build trust and likability, especially when you're navigating into new communities, right? Because if you come in as like, I'm the expert and I know, like people don't like that. They don't respond well to that. And they often had bad experiences, especially if they're a disenfranchised community that had experts come in and tell them they're going to fix everything. And then when the going gets tough, they're out of there. And the community just like, well, just keep plugging away on our own. So I think there's a lot there to dive into with the curiosity, likability, and trust. It also always makes me think of there's this marketing saying, know, like, and trust, right? And that's what you need to get somebody to engage with you, essentially to go from a stranger to someone who's interested in doing something with you or having you help solve their problems. And as I studied marketing and kind of really digging into it, I was like, it flows nicely to say no, like, and trust, but the reality of how those relationships are built, it's really they have to know you exist, and then they have to trust that you're safe to talk to, and then they can open up to liking you, and that so often, right, that trust piece is really, really essential to just unlock like because until we have trust, I think our brains, like, get stuck in, like, it's potential danger mode if I'm in a new scenario, right? And we're kind of closed. And then once we're like, okay, we trust the safety of the situation or the person, then we're ready to like explore something more. So thank you for putting that all together and such richness in there. We are at time. So first I want to just ask you one kind of final question. When you prepare to work with groups, how do you like to prepare at the beginning of the day for yourself?
I'm a big early morning person, so I'm an early riser, and I have, routines around that. And I just find it sets me up for success in the day. And one of my mentors is named Matt Church, and he was the person who said to me that state is more important than script. And so how we show up for our day, for our workshop, whatever it might be, is actually much more important than what we planned to do or say. And so I write about this a little bit in my first book, which is called Nimble. It's about facilitation and sort of holding loosely to your script. And part of it is that you got to pay attention to how you're showing up and whether that is the kind of basics of good sleep and nutrition and hydration and movement and all that stuff, emotional regulation and, calming your nerves, knowing yourself enough in the room to know what the triggers are going to be that are likely to send you into an unhelpful direction, those kinds of things. And so for me, depending on the day, it's about good nutrition. It's about making sure I'm getting my workout in. It's about getting to a place early enough that I'm not rushing when the session starts. I can build connection with people as they're arriving. Those kinds of things are pretty important. And yeah, so if I'm not at the gym, I'm walking my dog. It's one or the other, but there's some movement and some fresh air and some connection and a few gains on my phone, probably.
I love it. So important. And I think you've highlighted something for everyone who's thinking about like how to improve themselves as a leader or like what to work on. And I always feel like, I'm always working on something leadership, skill wise, sailing wise. And I ask people on my sailboat, when they come on, like, what do you feel like you're really strong at? And what are you working on right now? And fostering that growth mindset. But I think if we're leading people I often tell my clients, like, the first thing when you have to be prepared emotionally and learning the skills of emotional regulation beyond what you need to feel good. But in order to really influence and bring people together, you've got to have like next level emotional regulation skills so that when you walk in that room, I usually say, like, your first job is to read the room and you got to be ready, like you said, like to adapt, to be fluid because you don't know, like, sometimes it could be a surprise. I remember once I was doing the same workshop with, like, different departments at a large organization, and I was came into the room for my last one, and they'd all gone, like, pretty they'd gone very well and similar, kind of vibe at the organization, and I get into the last one, and first of all, I thought I was 30 minutes early, and they thought I was 30 minutes late, and there was, like, this like, "Oh, we don't wanna be here" vibe in the room, and boy, was I glad that, I mean, it was not helpful that I was walking into a room of people waiting for me when I thought, I like to be a little early and be prepared, but it required a full pivot. I was like, "Oh, my normal workshop plan is out the door because we're not gonna move forward with this kind of, like, tension in the room," like, and you have to be ready sometimes to put together a whole new plan to address what you walked into, and I think that happened a lot. I saw in the pandemic, especially in the beginning, there were a lot of staff meetings, people were clearly, afraid and uncomfortable, and you can't really just, like, do big visioning, right, if you don't address those things. So, I love that you shared that. I think that's so helpful to folks. For those thinking, "I do want more," Rebecca, what's the best way to reach out to you or follow your work, and what kinds of folks are those who should be reaching out?
Thanks for asking that. In terms of kinds of folks, I work primarily with mission-driven leaders. And a lot of what I'm doing is working with organizations that are and individual people that are navigating transition, navigating dynamic, volatile environments. Who is it, right? But generally, it tends to be fairly experienced senior board chairs and large nonprofit leaders who follow along with my work. And the way to do that is pretty simple. It's just my name is my website. So it's RebeccaSutherns.com. And Southerns has no O in it. It's not like South. It's Sutherns. And there are two specific ways that I would love people to think about following up, unless they wanted to, engage in coaching or facilitation, that kind of thing. It's fine. But maybe some bite-sized ways to get to know each other. One is that I have new sets of card decks called possibility packs, and they are questions, one deck for organizations, one deck for individuals. And then there's a combined one that has a few other bonus creativity prompts in it. But the decks are to help people reimagine their next chapter. So back on what you were saying about, the importance of a good question and what do you ask? I often say to people who are new to this, you don't have to come up with all those questions. You can literally buy a deck of cards from me or someone else that had some ideas for you. So those possibility packs are available. If you go to RebeccaSutherns.com/podcast, you can find them there. And then the other thing, I just want to pick up on the book idea. You mentioned being a reader and a slow one, but a committed one. I run a free monthly digital book club called Wiser by Choice, but it's also kind of called the No Reading Required Book Club. I read about somewhere between 4 and 7 titles a month that I present on for an hour. And I take those titles from the business, leadership, self-help table at the airport bookstore, largely. It's kind of the current titles that are getting some buzz. I read them. People come and go, let me know enough about this so I can decide if this thing is worth my time to read or not, because all of us know that leaders read, but that leaders don't take the time to read as much as they'd like. So for your listeners that want a bit of a free gift that is, I think, one of the highest value things I do, go have a look at my website under book club, sign up. And if you can't be there, I run it once a month, twice. I live in the Eastern time zone, same as New York. I run it at breakfast and at lunch. But if you can't be there, if you're registered, we send you the recording and you can decide if any of those titles are worth your time or not. So Card Decks and Book Club would be a quick and easy way for us to get to know each other. There's a blog there as well into your inbox once a week. So if you're not needing kind of the broader coaching or strategy work, those are 3 specific ways that we could spend some time together before those bigger processes happen.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for your lifetime of work and your current works and for putting together those two resources, which really sound truly valuable to folks. And thank you out there for listening and everything you do to make our communities better wherever you are. I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe and review this podcast wherever you're listening to it because it helps the algorithm share it with even more folks. And that's why it's here to be a resource for folks like you, or just share an episode with a friend or colleague who would benefit. Until next time, I wish you all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.